right, hi everybody. Welcome to the lecture on the anthropology of food. It wouldn't seem like food is really important to cultures, but in truth, it really is. That anthropologists have used how people get food to determine, or at least hypothesize, a lot of social norms and cultural facts that people have, display, or possess because it's one of our basic needs. We need to eat, we need to have water, and so people have come up with a variety of solutions on how to get that food, how to distribute that food, how to trade that food, how to sell that food. And so figuring out which of the several basic methods to get food a society uses is actually really important in understanding them. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, everybody eats, and people do it in a variety of different ways. And of course, I'm giving this lecture right now as I've skipped breakfast, and I'm staring at these food pictures, as hopefully it's not the same for you. But because everybody eats, we've come up with a variety of methods to get, make, create, move food, to eat food. We even have different concepts of what food is and what food isn't. Right? To some people, insects are food, and to some people, insects are gross and annoying, right? But in a biological sense, insects are filled with protein and really good. So not only is it how you get your food that is culturally determined, but what you consider food and what you don't consider food is largely determined by your culture. And most cultures consider things that they biologically could eat to not be food because of cultural social norms. So, because everybody eats, there's a lot of cultural variability in food and etiquette concerning food. There's variability in how you get it, what you eat, and the rules or norms associated with eating it. So, how you get your food or food procuring strategies are very important, and in many ways, I think, foundational to your culture in general. So we briefly touched on the fact that there are multiple ways that cultures go about getting food, right? We often pretend, somewhat ethnocentrically, that agriculture and domestication are the only ways to get food. But in reality, if we consider the human species to have existed for, let's say, 350,000 years, which is our current estimate, that's when we decide that Homo erectus, ergaster, and the various other creatures like that slowly became Homo sapiens sapiens, us, then agriculture has only existed, or at least domestication has only existed, for 13,000 years, or at least that we can see it, right? At least evidence for it. So, I mean, that's less than one third, or it's about 1/3 of a percent of our total existence, right? And that was one culture. The Natufian culture in the Fertile Crescent started domesticating plants and animals. So in reality, humans have been gatherer hunters, hunter gatherers for way longer than we've been practicing agriculture, pastoralism, or horticulture, at least that we can find evidence for. So one of those things that I like to mention a lot is that biologically, humans are still programmed to be gatherer hunters, but we're living in this industrialized agricultural world, and so sometimes that makes us difficult. It makes it difficult for us to make the right decisions about food. It's also somewhat risky to think of various ways to get food as being a unilineal evolutionary scheme. Just like we talked about with Morgan's concept that you have to master fire, then you'll master the bow and arrow, right? That some people have made the decision to domesticate things and then went back to gathering and hunting, and many gatherer hunters totally knew how plants worked, but they just didn't choose to practice agriculture because of the potential consequences thereof. So keep in mind, a unilineal evolutionary scheme is one that only goes one way, and you only get progress through this scheme, and that's just not how humans developed, right? And in this case, evolution simply means change over time, not necessarily natural selection. So as I'm giving this lecture, having not eaten breakfast, I might actually need to take a break and eat breakfast. This lecture has a lot of food pictures, and I apologize for that. If you haven't eaten, stop watching this lecture and go eat something, then come back. So largely anthropologists, or at least I, divide the methods of food procurement into four major types. Remember, and I'm going to say this a lot throughout this lecture, that I'm going to offer you a lot of typologies on human behavior, but in many ways, human behavior kind of defies typologies. So some people might gather and hunt while practicing a bit of horticulture. Some people might be pastoralists who mix in a bit of agriculture, so on and so forth. So if I say that this is a gathering and hunting society, that doesn't mean necessarily that that's all that they do. It's just a simple label that I can apply to them when most of those things are true. So keep in mind, all these typologies I offer you, humans definitely can defy those types and mix in a little horticulture with their agriculture or a little horticulture with their pastoralism or whatever. It's really hard to build typologies of human behavior. And despite that, anthropologists try to do it. So hunting and gathering, or gathering and hunting, is when people live off the land, right? They have to stay mobile. On average, it takes about 1 square mile or 1 square kilometer. I know those are very different numbers, but it varies depending on where you are, to support a hunter-gatherer group per person. So if you have a 25-person group, about 25 square miles. This, of course, varies greatly depending on how rich and diverse the landscape that you live on is. So if you're living in the rainforest with a lot of resources and a lot of diverse resources, maybe it takes less space to do that. If you're living in the Kalahari with very few resources out in the desert, it probably takes more space. So the amount of space it takes to support a gathering hunting society really depends on the environment they live on and how resource rich it is, right? There are still modern gathering and hunting societies today. The San in Africa, some of them are still gathering and hunting. The Inuit in past times gathered and hunted. There are lots of cultures that did it in the past. In fact, everybody did it in the past. But those people still remaining who gather and hunt to survive are becoming more and more scarce. That's largely because agricultural societies don't really play well with gatherer hunters. Or you could argue that gatherer hunters don't really play well with agricultural societies, because we tend to set up state level governments that try to box people into states with country borders and things like that, and gatherer hunters have to keep moving. So a lot of times they don't respect those state boundaries. We can grow way more food on 25 square miles of land than gatherer hunters can gather from 25 square miles of land. So in many ways, we kind of view gatherer hunters as kind of wasting the landscape. So it is becoming less adapted to be a gatherer hunter in this industrial world, despite our efforts in some cases to kind of protect the people who are living a gathering hunting lifestyle. All right, and I'm back. I literally had to go eat some food. So horticulture is the production of plant foods with only the use of hand tools, and that's different from agriculture, because agriculture is where you bring in livestock that pull heavy plows, or later in an industrialized society, usually mechanized machines that help you make way more food on the same amount of land. So often horticulture is combined with gathering and hunting. The overall scale of the food production is very low. Typically, you make enough food to feed yourself, your family, any livestock you have. The Trobriand Islanders, basket maker culture of the southwest U.S. in antiquity, the Yanomamo are examples of groups who did this in the past, and some of which are still doing it today. Even if you have a garden out back that you're using to supplement your food, then you're practicing horticulture, unless you're selling it at the farmer's market or something like that. So basically, this is when people produce enough food using very low-scale means to feed themselves and their family, or supplement gathering and hunting, or supplement living in an industrialized society. Typically, this is going to use hand tools, and you're not going to make enough food to sell it, and if you do, it would be very, very low scale. Pastoralism, people still practice pastoralism. Pastoralism is when you breed and manage large herds of domesticated animals. So you're pretty mobile in that you have to follow those animals where they go. Examples include some of the Sami in northern Europe were, believe it or not, reindeer herders. The Nuer in northern Africa, and the Kurds in the Middle East. So this results in people moving around a lot. They're usually entirely dependent on domesticated animals. They'll usually end up really considering those animals to be their primary source of wealth. For instance, among the Nuer, When a woman gets married, the man's family pays a bride price in cattle to the woman's family. So a lot of times cattle becomes, or the animal you herd, whatever it is, becomes your primary display of wealth. And it also results in you being highly mobile. And keep in mind, this is separate from industrialized societies, which have animals. This isn't being a cowboy out west, and kind of is, but this is when your entire society is dependent on these animals and moving to keep up with these animals. So agriculture, or at least industrialized agriculture, is what we do here in the United States. This is the production of food on a large scale. This often includes the labor of large animals or later mechanized, industrialized machines. And the individual farmer or family of farmers produce far more food than you and your family can consume. This leads to a very important concept called specialization, right? Meaning that if I make enough food for 25 other people, those 24 other people beyond myself are allowed to do something else, right? We're going to talk about that in depth. Agriculture often includes major changes to the landscape, such as irrigation, large-scale investment in plants and soil, and domestication of plants and animals occurs fully, right? That we will change the genetic code of these animals simply by selecting the animals or plants or parts of the animal of plants or plants that we like the best. So domestication is the evolutionary process whereby humans modify, either intentionally or unintentionally, the genetic makeup of a population of plants or animals, sometimes to the extent that the member of the population are unable to survive or reproduce without human assistance. So if you are not a human, right, if you're another animal, the best thing, evolutionarily speaking, for you to be is useful to humans, right? We have taken animals like cows and really increased their population. So if you look at a population of cows versus a population of bison, they are almost the same animal, but the core difference is we domesticated cows, we did not domesticate bison, and cow population is so much larger than bison population. There are a number of historical factors for that, but the overall overwhelming important factor is that we domesticated cows, we caused them to breed rapidly, and so their population is thriving and doing well to the point where the methane that they fart out is actually infecting the atmosphere, whereas bison are not doing as well until we've kind of helped them along. They've made a comeback. So keep that in mind, that domestication in an evolutionary sense is very good for the plant or animal that we domesticate, but we genetically change it to make it more pleasing to us. So when a plant is domesticated through, it shouldn't be natural, through selection, through human selection, the edible portion increases in size. Sometimes it becomes domesticated to the point where it loses seed dispersal. In other words, we become the method of seed dispersal, whereas a lot of plants have kind of ingenious evolutionary methods to disperse their seeds. Think of maple trees with those little helicopters that they send their seeds out with. That plant becomes completely dependent on us for seed dispersal. We don't want the plant putting energy into methods of seed dispersal. We want the plant putting energy into whatever product we want, the cotton, the food, whatever. And so we will pick the plant that puts less energy into seed dispersal and more energy into the fruit, whatever we want, until that method of seed dispersal might go away altogether, and we, in fact, become the plant's primary method of dispersing its seeds. We don't like thorns. We don't like things that make us itchy, things like that. Through selection, we are going to reduce the size of protective husks. We are going to get rid of any plants that have thorns, things like that, because simply we want that plant to spend as much of its energy as possible on the fruit or the thing we want, the product, right, so to speak. Animals are a little more complex. They typically get larger and then smaller because we want them to be small and easy control. Typically they get less violent, right? We're going to pick the least violent animal and make it have as many children as possible because we want docile domesticated animals. Typically it gains fat because fat tastes good. It reproduces faster simply because we encourage it to reproduce. So if you have one animal that can reproduce in 6 months and one animal that can reproduce in 5 months and 2 weeks, Because we're going to encourage it to reproduce as quickly as possible, eventually that animal that can reproduce in 5 months and 2 weeks will outnumber its children, will outnumber the one that can produce in 6 months. So via selection, we will slowly take the reproduction cycle, the amount of time required, down simply by allowing the animal to constantly reproduce. Typically it becomes less intelligent. There are exceptions to that. Dogs and cats, for instance, but we're going to look for docile, quickly reproducing, high fat having, less violent animals to domesticate, and then we're going to continually help those animals that are less violent, more fatty, so on and so forth, reproduce such that those animals will outnumber the other animals in the population. So animals that domesticate really well are dumb animals, pack animals, and docile animals. Dumb animals are easy to control. Pack animals, basically all you have to do is insert yourself as the pack leader. That's essentially what we did to dogs. And docile animals are, of course, easier to control than animals that have more violent tendencies. The cow on the left there is the perfect example of the dumb pack docile animal. They're really easy to control. They are really easy to feed. And so in many ways are kind of the perfect domesticated animal. Old World had a lot of domesticated plants, but mostly here I'm focusing down on the grains. The biggest and most important, and let's say the most important plants that are domesticated in the Old World, being Europe, Africa, Asia, are wheat, barley, and rice. What these three things have, well, these three things have a lot of things in common. First off, they are easy to store. Which is really important. You build up a surplus to survive the winter and things like that. Or you build up a surplus just so you can use it against people to form governments. So being storable is really important. Another thing that these three plants have in common is they can all be used to make alcohol. This may sound like a joke, but some people have argued that the basis of agriculture lies in making alcohol, and it's hard to disprove them. So wheat, barley, and rice were the three major plants that were storable, easy to grow, and really worked well for people in the Old World. In the New World, you had what was often referred to as the Three Sisters. Corn, maize, as it's more properly called, beans, and squash. These three work really well together because together they provide pretty much complete nutrition, especially if you supplement with some protein from deer hunting or something like that. The three plants can be grown in the same field. In fact, what one takes away from the soil, the other one gives back to the soil. And so in terms of plants, the New World, North and South America, got a really good deal once these kind of plants had spread around. Potatoes, tomatoes are also native to the New World, and a couple other plants, but these are the three really important ones. Corn is storable and provides empty calories. Beans and squash are really, really good for you, nutritionally speaking, so together they were a very good trio of domesticatable plants. The Old World really lucked out when it came to domesticatable animals. You have the ox, cow, horse, dog, goats, sheep, pigs, and chickens. Ox are really important because they can pull things. I did not pick the picture in the top left randomly. They are set up to pull a plow. It really helps when you're farming if you don't have to do all the hard work yourself. It is very hard to run a oxen team for plowing. You have to keep the plow down into the ground, which requires a lot of strength. But it is certainly easier when those two dumb animals are stalwartly pulling the plow forward through the ground. So having work animals that were easily domesticated like the Old World did was such a huge advantage. This is a problem for the New World. Here are the domesticatable animals, or at least the animals that got domesticated. The llama, dog, alpaca, and the mighty guinea pig. Right? The dog may have been domesticated so long ago that it came over with people from Asia into the New World, so that one may have been brought over by the initial gatherers and hunters that settled North and South America. But llamas and alpacas, while they're very, very useful for their wool, are not great work animals. I read in a book on the Incan Empire that a llama or alpaca can carry 40 pounds worth of weight every other day. And then, of course, I add if they feel like it. They're really kind of ornery animals. and aren't well set up morphologically in terms of bone structure to push, pull, or they're not work animals. While they are very, very useful, the guinea pig is, of course, a joke of a work animal. And I can only stress to you that if you're domesticating the guinea pig for meat, you must be really, really desperate for something to domesticate for meat. The hare to meat ratio is very much in favor of hare. Guinea pigs are eaten in South America. And they are somewhat of a delicacy, believe it or not. And there's a game that goes along in some places with eating guinea pigs. I know we think of them as pets, but they domesticated them for food. I've even seen instances in which guinea pigs are used for shamanic rituals. I will show you an example of that later in the semester. So keep in mind, here's the end of the story, kind of. In terms of domesticatable animals, the New World got a really, really bad deal. And the Old World basically got everything it needed. So we've talked about how they get their food, but what do they choose to eat? Are there things that other cultures eat that you find disgusting? And the answer is probably yeah. But so basically your culture can determine what you think of as food and what you don't. Think about the onion soup story from your textbooks. That's exactly what that story is about, right? So if you haven't read that, go back and take a look, because that's exactly what we're talking about. That your culture can color what you think of as food and what you don't think of as food, and it can talk you into thinking of things as not food, when in reality they're, biologically speaking, very nutritious for you and frankly sometimes easy to catch. So can you think of anything one of the cultures that you are within eats that people may find disgusting? Some people eat crawfish in the South, and other people find that utterly disgusting. Some people eat, pickled eggs and things like that. So as kind of funny and harmless as this can be, realize that your culture affects what you think of as food and what you don't think of as food. So again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, think about the onion soup story in the textbook. Again, if you haven't read that, go back and take a look. It's in one of the earlier chapters. So while you may think your taste buds are entirely biological, the foods you like are certainly culturally influenced. Though we think of it as highly gross, many cultures eat bugs. It turns out they are super nutritious. Even past cultures that we pattern ourselves after ate bugs. Aristotle described methods of harvesting cicada, and the Romans ate beetle larvae. It turns out that bugs are everywhere. There are more bugs on the planet than anything else, that they're actually pretty nutritious, and honestly, in many cases, pretty easy to catch. So even though many cultures think of them as not being food, that's actually a non-adaptive way to be. That effectively bugs are easy to catch, they're everywhere, and we should be eating them in terms of what biologists call optimal foraging, trying to get maximum calories for minimum effort. So your culture is talking you into making bad evolutionary choices, which is not eating bugs. Because bugs are everywhere, super nutritious, and easy to catch. So finally, we come to the third aspect of culture and eating: rules for eating. I mean, do we in westernized culture have any rules for eating? Of course we do, right? You're not supposed to put your elbows on the table. You're not supposed to chew with your mouth open. There are even structures for how you put your forks, knives, spoons on the table in polite company. Now, those are ones we've been taught, like, hey, this is what you do while you're eating. But there are actually a lot of unconscious social norms concerning eating. And my personal favorite that nobody has ever told me, but I've worked out using cultural anthropological methods, and usually when I'm teaching this in person, I have a discussion about this. But there are rules about what foods you can eat with your hands and what foods you can't. And there are some exceptions, but the only logic that I've come to is you are allowed to eat a food with your hand if it's fried or bread is used as a barrier. So bread is something that universally you can pick up with your hands, and that's okay. So for instance, like pizza is very cheesy and messy, but we put a crust on it, so you're allowed to hold the crust and eat it with your hand. Ribs, really messy. You're allowed to eat those with your hands because there's that little bone, the ends, that you can grab onto and eat. Buffalo wings, same deal. They have those convenient end points that aren't absolutely drenched in sauce. So basically, we have unwritten rules about what foods you can eat with your hands and what foods you can't. Eating your salad with your hands is right out. Eating peas or vegetables, things that are easily forkable or spoonable, are of course right out. But you know these rules, and you may not know the logic behind them, but you kind of watched other people until you figured these rules out, right? So sometimes it's really, those rules are so ingrained that you have to really think about why they are the way they are. And so I challenge you to kind of think about, try to categorize what foods you can eat with your hands and what foods you can't, and try to figure out the rules. I personally think it's, you can eat something with your hands if there's something convenient that you're not going to eat, that you can hold on to. That's my, or bread. Bread you can eat and both touch. I don't know why that's the rule, but it is. So it's just something to think about, that there are a lot of social norms concerning eating that you weren't directly taught, but you did pick up on. And if you spend some time like, okay, why can't I eat this with my hands and not this? Why can't I put my elbows on the table? That really, it's often kind of hard to figure out why the rules are what they are, functionally speaking. But they're certainly out there, and you've certainly picked up on them during the process of being enculturated in Western culture. So some meals can vary in formality, and when they become more formal, there are often more rules associated with them. One of the most formal meals that can be eaten is the Japanese tea ceremony. The steps of these ceremonies are highly ritualized, that the host may even practice, they have to practice these precise movements before the ceremony. So we do have some dinners that are that highly ritualized, but I don't think to the point where we have to practice much anymore. But there are still some finishing schools that will literally teach you how to eat dinner in polite company, how to use your fork, where to place your fork, not put your elbows on the table, when you're allowed to talk, so on and so forth. So depending on the formality of the setting, the explicit rules can become very complicated and cross-culturally different, right? There's an old story about World War II where they actually caught German spies, or spies being in Germany, because at the time, all German citizens were taught to eat with their fork in their left hand and their knife in their right hand. And we in the United States and in Britain tend to switch that. We tend to put the fork in our dominant hand, which for most people is the right hand. So sometimes these rules are very, very important, and messing them up can really embarrass you. So the point is that we have really formalized rules about food. Many of them have just been so ingrained during your cultural education that you don't think about them. So a concept that I like to present along with food is the cultural concept of what's called matter out of place. It's not directly related to food, but it certainly can be. So matter out of place is the culturally held concept that certain material goods should only be ever found in certain environments. The idea is that some items, just through their functionality, are dirty, right? The example would be if I were to go out and buy an unused plunger, right? I go to Walmart or Target, I buy the plunger, it's never been used, it's clean, and I left it on your kitchen table, that would unnerve you, right? Because plungers, toilet paper, things like that are kind of dirty until until proven clean. So that we have this idea that certain items are just profane and don't deserve to be near food or in our kitchen. Matter out of place is particularly applicable to food and food-related items, and it can vary from one culture to the next in terms of what items are considered matter out of place and where they are considered to be in an inappropriate spot. So it's another example of social norms that you know that you don't know you know, right? That in fact, if I went around placing plungers on people's kitchen tables that were absolutely clean, people would move them and it would unnerve them. So the concept that certain items are profane or dirty is culturally learned, effectively, is what I'm getting at. And that concept is called matter out of place. I challenge you all to think of more examples of this at home. of matter out of place, it's kind of hard to do, but feel free if you do to place those in that general discussion, not the weekly discussion, but then that general discussion forum, and discuss that there. If you come up with any really interesting, maybe, keep it polite, but any interesting ideas of what might be matter out of place in our culture. All right, that's all I got for this lecture. Check out the next one on food.